A good place to start here, as we welcome Rob Stutzman for the first time on PolitiCast, would be to start with this interview, the Harris-Walz interview, the first sit-down interview that we've seen with Kamala Harris, yet not on her own, having to do so with her running mate. What did you make of that interview? Was it a successful one for her campaign to do, or was it just something that she had to get out of the way?
Well, I think it was successful. I mean, I don't think she did anything to hurt herself. I'd give her a solid B on it. You know, what we saw are things that are familiar still, kind of long, rambling answers at times. I think her aversion to making more direct eye contact is odd. So, I mean, there's just some performance things I think could be better, but she did fine. I don't think she really got asked a question that she didn't anticipate and prepare for. That's not necessarily a criticism of Dana Batch. I thought she did, a fine enough job, but it would have been interesting to see come up with something that maybe she wouldn't be as prepared for. The prime minister of Uzbekistan type question. So there needs to be more tests and interviews. But the amazing thing is here's Harris, who's got all these shifting issues, particularly since she was a primary candidate in 2019 and tried to be, an uber progressive. And yet, what's really happening today in the presidential race is the Trump campaign trying to clean up his shifting, if not confusing, and unclear position on the 6-week abortion ban that'll be on the ballot in Florida, where he'll be casting a vote.
Yeah, Will, I'd add that, look, I think the fact that Kamala showed up, the liberal news media is going to say that it's a win, that she's answered her critics. But it is troubling. I mean, she had her emotional support governor, Tim Walz, by her side to reassure her. The questions were not what I would consider challenging by any stretch of the imagination. Although I will tell you, I think that her campaign has cracked the Trump code of him dominating the news cycle, and they're largely doing it by just saying he's boring or he's yesterday's news. Let's move on and talk about the future. And look, it's been tried by many and failed, and I think that at least for right now, she's really doing a good job of freezing him out of news coverage that has been really proven to be difficult in the past. And I think that it's making her have she has a good look to her. She talks more about the future than Donald Trump does. And Donald Trump seems to be obsessed with, reminding people why they hate him so much, and taking great joy in doing that. And meanwhile, Kamala Harris is like, who cares? Let me talk about what I want to do. Let me tell you my vision that's devoid of specifics, but people don't want to stress about the presidency every day. They want the government to basically mildly work and stay out of their lives. And at least Kamala Harris is doing a better job of that right now. So.
Yeah, well, Matt raises a great point. She is doing a great job on it. So in the interview last night, Bash asked her about Trump demeaning her ethnicity and her gender, and Harris won't discuss it. She basically said, well, same old, some things don't change. Next question. Bash goes, no, that's it. And she goes, that's it. Next question. That actually is pretty remarkable discipline because of how that must personally feel to her. But that keeps the interview moving on to the future, like what Matt's talking about, instead of litigating what a terrible human being Trump is, which we've been litigating for the last 8 years. Even people that are going to vote for him agree he's a terrible human being. So, she didn't waste time on that. And I think that was one of those things about the interview last night that showed discipline, and it's consistent with what her campaign is doing, to Matt's point.
Someone else who just did this, and not to plug my interview for tomorrow, that will air tomorrow on Saturday, Eyewitness News Investigates, but we were doing our candidate interviews with Rudy Salas and David Valadao, and Rudy Salas has continued to make this point that David Valadao's not Latino because he has a Portuguese background. He says, I'm going to be the first Democrat in the Central Valley, or first representative who's Latino throughout from here, Bakersfield, all the way up to Sacramento, which almost invalidates Jim Costa as well, I guess. But But it was just an interesting question. So I asked Representative Valadeo about that, since he does speak 3 languages, and I wanted to get his thoughts. Same exact answer. Let's just move on and get on to this next topic, which I thought was really fascinating. And that he has very similar playbooks, opposite sides of the aisle, to continue that conversation. And then sort of what seemed fresh about, I guess, Donald Trump in 2016 was the fact about making America great again, getting away from what we've seen in the past. And then now it seems like he may be the one who's relitigating the past, right? He's the one who is constantly caught up in these political fights, whether it's with the governor of Georgia or it's with people that he's already beaten in elections. He just can't seem to, I guess, grasp that his opponent in this race is Kamala Harris and not somebody else, a past political opponent.
Well, he's shown a degree, he being Donald Trump has shown a considerable degree of inflexibility, and he's running the same campaign that he largely did against Joe Biden. But Kamala's people have been very successful as framing this as a change election. And yes, she is the quote unquote incumbent, but she's also a newer, fresher face, and Trump is a retreat back to 2017 to 2021. And right now, she's doing a more disciplined and compelling job of framing that election and making it really easy for voters. And I mean, look, a stem winder speech from Donald Trump that lasts a concise 1 hour and 40 minutes is not going to attract people to him, because it's not even the road less traveled. I mean, it weaves from side to side, and he comes back and makes the same point over and over again. And if that, the 32% or 35% that would be with Trump if he literally shot someone on Fifth Avenue, I mean, yeah, he appeals to them, but everybody else just is like, ugh, I have more important things to do with my day than watch this.
And I think he's starting to fumble on policy. So let's think about this election, right? This comes down to, a few 100,000 Americans in 7 states. It is what it is, right? So, those voters, I think, are listening to policy. And so then you get Trump last night in a town hall with Tulsi Gabbard supposedly moderating it. And he supports comes out in support of IVF, in vitro fertilization, which the Democrats have been trying to use as an issue against the Republicans. But then he declares that government's going to pay for it for everybody. Yeah, and this is the guy that was, ran in 2016 that he was going to repeal the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare. I mean, it's a confusing, baffling, unmoored policy position to take. And then you add that to the stumble that we already talked about on, well, what's really his position on 6-week abortion ban in Florida? And all of a sudden, he's getting entangled into being really unclear and unreliable as to what those swing voters might really want to lean on him on, which is largely economic issues. But then again, all of his tariff threats, I think, are, popular writ large in national polling. You get to those specific college-educated suburban voters in those states, those swing states, I'm not so sure that they see that as something that'll be beneficial to them. He's starting to stumble on policy.
Yeah. And he's just not relating to, I mean, he's doing everything he can to make his base smaller and more consolidated, which is exactly the opposite of how you win elections. You don't bring, let's not bring people into the fold. Let's alienate people who might be inclined to support us on our basic views of government, smaller government, less activist government, and say, well, we'll now have government pay for in vitro fertilization. J.D. Vance has talked about, a child tax credit that couldn't make its way through the Republican or the democratically controlled Senate because Republicans blocked it. I mean, it's kind of like people are going, well, wait, if I want someone who's going to expand government, why do I want that government light? I'm just going to go with the real thing, which is Kamala Harris. I mean, and Trump is all mixed up. And the problem is, as we all know, is Trump keeps his own counsel. And I mean, being a political consultant to Donald Trump would either be the greatest job in the world because you probably make a ton of money and you don't have to do anything, or the most frustrating job in the world because you have these great ideas largely grounded in research that he's not going to listen to. So, I mean, Trump right now, in my opinion, is doing everything he can to lose this election. And he doesn't have there's not a lot of runway for him to figure out how to turn this thing around.
Well, the only thing that seems to be in his favor are the opinion pollings on the issues, where it does show that he's ahead on a lot of those economy issues when you go on these polls. But then once you just go to the personality and the character, and then also the abortion issue, which is a big one in women's healthcare, that turns into quite a big hole for him. And it doesn't seem like anything that kind of like what you were talking about earlier about the child tax credit, where you have a situation where you have something that was voted down or blocked by Republicans in the Senate. You also had a border bill that I thought was maybe a good answer from Harris last night to talk about, hey, we had something that was there that was then blocked in the Senate. Is that not, you're not quite as convinced there, Matt?
That was never happened. I mean, look, I mean, I know Senator Langford negotiated that compromise, but anything that allows up to 5 million people to enter this country illegally in a year, that was a non-starter. It didn't take Trump to kill it. It was going to die of its own weight anyway. I mean, I still think that the Democrats have been hoisting that petard forever, that or that fallacy that they would have solved the border crisis if this legislation had just passed. They've let 12 million people into this country illegally. Look what's happening in Aurora, Colorado. And Kamala Harris supports a general amnesty and a pathway to citizenship. That's never going to work its way through Congress unless the Democrats change the voting rules and get rid of the filibuster, in which case there could very likely be significant unrest in a number of states across the union. So, I mean, the abortion issue, the Democrat, it's a loser for them. All they got to do is turn on the news, or I'll turn on the television and talk about the killings and the fentanyl. That is a direct result of the Biden and Harris policy.
But she went back in time to say that she's not the border czar, so it's okay.
All good, but
Yeah.
her values remain the same.
That's the other thing too, right? It's somehow making it about migration, and I think Vance had a good answer about that in a recent interview. But it's whether or not that can then make it to the mainstream, and whether Trump can repeat that same answer, which was, okay, she's the migration czar, same issue, which was that response that Vance had. And moving on to Vance's counterpart, Tim Walz, he was pressed a little bit on his background. That it was interesting to kind of hear him on the record on a few things too. What did you make of his performance last night? Does it matter as much, I guess, that he's the vice presidential candidate, or that part of the branding is now camouflage hats?
I mean, the main thing Tim Walz did last night, I don't know why they had him there, because of course Bash isn't going to ask him much of anything except the obvious, which is, why did you embellish your military record? So he sat there just kind of smiling, looking at her like one of the old guys in the balcony on the Muppets. And it was weird staging, terrible press advance job by this is like an old campaign hack gripe. They had the camera angles look this much taller than her. It's like, why even have him there? And then I give him a lower grade than her, because he mumbles through and does not have a good answer for why he embellished earlier in his career when running for Congress what his military record was. So I thought he was a net negative on the last night. She would have looked stronger without him sitting there like some type of comfort pet. And his answer to the one question he got wasn't good.
Well, he has lots of questions too about him, and initially, specifically going back to the 2020 protests and riots in Minnesota, but he has so many questions about him too, because it seemed like there was all this vetting for him in comparison to what the Trump campaign did for Vance, and instead of that, we thought, okay, they're going through Bashir, they're going through Kelly, of course, Shapiro. We can get into why they didn't choose Shapiro, but you would have thought that these are things that would have been answered, I guess, in the vetting process as well, or they just don't think it matters because I don't know, they didn't predict this bump in the polls at the time, but I guess with the DNC convention coming up, they could have imagined it was going to happen. It just seems like quite a surprising pick, looking back on it.
Look, the outlier, which is where everybody goes, is the Sarah Palin pick by John McCain. But vice presidential picks rarely hamper their running mate. It's everything focuses on Trump and Harris. That's where they're, and basically what you want the vice presidential candidates to do is to play attack dog, or in this case, attack Trump and the smile on your face, which Governor Walz has done. And JD Vance is assuming the more traditional rule where you go out and you attack, and attack and attack. And usually then the presidential candidate can follow up with what his or her, in this case, her vision is for the future. Kamala Harris is doing that. Donald Trump is not. He attacks, but then he focuses back on, when he starts talking about crowd size and stolen election in 2020, that's when people just tune him out. And he's doing it with greater regularity, which means that he's frustrated. In many ways, the September 10th debate, the fact that the mics aren't hot is going to be a good thing for Donald Trump.
I agree with that. I think it was a good thing for him in the first debate with Biden. Just let Biden talk and did him in. Look, the Walz VP picks are for the base. The vetting, they knew about the questions about his military service. They were willing to work through that. Nobody comes out with a clean vet. Someone's going to always have something. But they chose, an avuncular middle-class white guy to go with Harris, which I think makes a lot of sense. And they wanted someone that would not outshine her, which I think he proved last night. I think that would have been very different last night, sitting there with Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, who's a much bigger, ambitious personality. So in some ways, I think Walz is playing exactly the role that they would want. And last night, I think, is proof of that. She sits there next to him. She performs better than him, which is important.
One last question on this. I mean, it's several parallels, I think, to 2016, where you have this vision towards the future, no specifics in particular. You have a vice presidential candidate who really doesn't outshine the head of the ticket. Someone who also was there to get the base of the white guys, and for Pence in 2016, it was to get the evangelicals. So just some very similar ideology. Then also to what Trump was in 2016. I guess he's trying to do it again now with things like the tax on tips and this tax credit stuff. But it's trying to appeal across the aisle a little bit too. And he tried to make that broad appeal as more of a populist, it seemed, at that time. And of course, now we're seeing the co-opting of camouflage gear, camo gear that you wouldn't really ever see for a Democrat candidate for the last several years that are trying to be implemented in this campaign. I guess circling back one last thing to this interview, I think, which is important here. I know fracking was something that's being talked about as an important issue in Pennsylvania. Should Californians here in the Central Valley be confident at all from anything that the Harris-Walz campaign has put out so far as it comes to oil production in this state? Of course, this on the looming special session, or if there is a special session here in California as well on energy policy.
No, Californians are way more worried about Gavin Newsom and his constant attacks on the oil and gas industry, and the fact that energy prices have skyrocketed across the board. And what the legislature's weekly talking about a $30 rebate, great, that, I can take my family to Starbucks for 2 cups of coffee and 2 muffins and I'll get that back. So, the federal government has very little impact in terms of California on oil and gas production. However, I will say that, Gavin Newsom is a much greater threat just because he is he's like a dog with a bone against the oil and gas industry, even though he knows he needs them. So he wants to try to make life as uncomfortable for them as possible.
Yeah, I agree with Matt. Newsom demagogues on this issue, and he's dishonest about it. The interesting thing to me is the policies now that he's trying to put into place would also have impacts upon fuel supply in Nevada and Arizona, because they take so much gas from refineries here. They don't have refineries in their states. So, if refineries are shutting down here, or you're having to divert supply into reserves in California, that's less supply out in the marketplace. That's less supply for Arizona and Nevada, conceivably. And I just think that's fascinating. This is a guy that wants to run for president. Nevada's an early caucus state. Who knows what will be on the calendar in the future, but it has been an early state. It's a swing state, and Arizona's a swing state. And these ads will write themselves in the future about, especially with so many California expats in those states that left California to get away from California policies. And here comes Gavin Newsom chasing them into their new states, their new homes with expensive fuel prices.
That's it's a fascinating issue because it really does not seem to help a political future for himself. I mean, there's a number of years in between, and of course, if Harris wins, I mean, there's a question of whether or not he's a viable candidate in however many years because he's out of the governorship in 26. There's gonna be a long time in between where people maybe don't remember him, and there's other people now that we've seen through this campaign that put themselves at the top of the ticket. Maybe he's just trying to do like his predecessor, just wait a few years in between and jump back and be a governor 30 years later. There's a possibility there as well. Who knows? I was going to say on the last point I wanted to talk about is the letter from Zuckerberg to Congress. We talked with Vince Fong about this yesterday. We actually talked with him about the refineries too. That's on our website, BakersfieldNow.com. But it was interesting to see that now people are House Republicans are very much championing the Zuckerberg letter, something that we never think that we'd see House Republicans ever champion Zuckerberg on. Does this have any impact on this election coming up, or are these just things again that are in the past that have happened, dating back from the 2016 disinformation, and of course as well the Hunter Biden hiding of that story, and of course COVID information as well. The thought that there was pressure from the Biden administration to censor information coming out on that.
Yeah, impact on the election, no. I think the fact that that Zuckerberg released it on a Friday in August is indicative of the fact that they tried to minimize the impact. It really is that Facebook CYAing themselves, that they want to make sure that Jim Jordan doesn't take off on a crusade against Facebook in the next Congress. But it is pretty devastating that's to talk about Russia disinformation and the Biden letter plus the COVID censorship. Although the recent Supreme Court decision allows the government to pretty much meddle in those companies should they be so inclined to do so. So it is nice to see Zuckerberg stand up for free speech. I mean, I'm sure he's probably tweaked about the 400 million for Zuckerbucks in 2020. So I think it's just Zuckerberg and his advisors being strategic from Meta's perspective, excuse me.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. This is it's not an issue that affects the election. It's a very online issue. There'll be a lot of MAGA or red pilled type media that says, oh, there it is, we told you so. And they're right about a lot of that. I mean, the government clearly tried to influence content, but to Matt's point, the court has held that that's not specifically censorship because it's still a private company that doesn't have to accede to the requests of government.
All right. Well, thank you very much, both of you. Appreciate your time as always. We'll look forward to, again, previewing this debate that'll be coming up in a couple of weeks. But until then, happy Labor Day, both of you. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time coming on with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.